Hi there, my name is Karen, and today I would love to talk to you about 50 books that I have found useful for the study and understanding of Russian history. To caveat this from the very beginning, I am a Russian history enthusiast, but that does not necessarily mean that I am an expert. This list is by no means comprehensive, and I'm not pretending that it is. And my pronunciation may at times not be great, for which I apologize. I am doing my best. The way that I am going to set up these 50 books, and as I say, this is not comprehensive. This is not necessarily every book I've ever read that's good about Russia, but it's what I think would be useful to somebody that is getting into the space. So I've broken up these books into a few general categories. So hopefully that is useful to you. Say that you're looking for something in Imperial Russia. Hopefully I have a book there that you might be interested in, but then you might be interested in Kievan Rus and Mongol. Perhaps you're just looking for an overview. Unfortunately, if you are looking for anything after about the year 2000, my list is not going to be very helpful to you because I am a historian. I am not a political scientist. So I'm not touching Putin yet. That's still 10 years away before I have to start worrying about that. Just kidding. I know a fair amount about Putin. I just don't want to recommend books about him. Okay, so to start, let's do general overview. So the first book that I would like to bring up is A History of Russia, Volume 1, which is going to go from, I think it's about 1000 to 1917. This is a general overview of Russian history. My husband calls it one of the driest books that he has ever had to read. But he also was not enthused about studying Russian history, so that might make the difference. I did not find it the driest book ever, and what I specifically like about this one is that it includes economic and social life and religious and culture life as subsections. For example, you've got like the reign of Catherine the Great as a whole period, and then you've got 18th century economic and social life, then 18th century religion and culture. And I just think that that's very useful to kind of break down two different things, because it's very easy to get sucked into kind of big man biographical history, which with Russia especially, it's very easy to get sucked into that. And you can kind of forget to talk about the peasants and the serfs and just the merchant classes that are going to be existing in this time period. I think you can also get a little bit away from the realities of what wars and conflicts look like. I think this is a good overview because it has that, and then it also has suggested sources. I feel I should also say I'm probably pretty outdated in my book recommendations. So these sources that are going to be in this book are probably outdated too, but that's okay. Outdated sources are still useful sources a lot of the time. Then the next general overview that I would like to bring up is Picturing Russia, a look at the visual culture in Russia. So it includes a lot of pictures, not in color, unfortunately, but it's basically how visually Russia has been expressing various parts about its identity. This is a very useful kind of, you can tie in some primary sources. So it's got a lot of primary sources in it, and then it gives explanation to that. So it does follow kind of, for the most part, a sequential investigation into Russian history, but it does so from a visual standpoint. So this is maybe more useful as a student of history, not necessarily as a pleasure read, but I do think that it is worth perusing. Russia of the Tsars. So this one you're going to be going from the 1600s, say, to 1917. So if you're new to Russian history and maybe you don't want to read the most boring book that I've ever read, according to my husband, which is not what this is, this might be a good starting point. It's got a lot of visual components to it. It's in color. It's not overly long, but I do think that it gives it kind of a short and sweet view on what that 400 years of history looks like, where you've kind of got the Romanov rule, Russian of the Tsars. So we're starting with Peter the Great in this one, and it goes till Nicholas and the Romanovs get. Here's one of my favorite things about Russia. What color did they seem to really think every book needs to be printed in? You know, I organized my books by author's last name, but if I did by color, by golly, the Russian books would still stay together. Want to see another red book? Look, it's this one, Land of the Firebird. This one is written by, what's her name, Suzanne Massie, and her husband, Robert Massie, we're going to get to later. He's also a Russian historian. So this is a mixture of a cultural history and a real history. It looks into architecture. It still is like telling us this great flow of history, but it's looking at artistic achievements of Russia too. So in a way, it's an overview. In a way, its goal is not necessarily to be telling a story of history. So this 44-year-old book, 45-year-old book, I think still has a lot of merit. And I still think it has a lot of really great things to say about Russia, though obviously we're talking about pre-fall of the Soviet Union when it comes to this book. From a cultural history, if we're really getting into that, one that I love is Natasha's Dance by Orlando Figes. I don't have that one currently because I've bought it probably about 5 times and then immediately lent it to someone else and never see it again. But Natasha's Dance is a cultural history of Russia in kind of a similar vein as the Firebird, but a little bit less history-based. In that same way, another book that I would recommend as a cultural history of Russia is this one, Russians by Gregory Feifer. And this one is very much a more modern cultural history, but it does do some drawbacks to earlier times. So with this one, you're looking at things like extravagance, poverty, drinking, intimacy, domestic order, inefficiency, the avant-garde, cold. It's trying to break down kind of these cultural markers that we really associate with Russia here in the West and trying to break down why those cultural markers exist and whether there's any merit to the idea that they are significant or that they are a real part of Russian culture, and how that may have developed from a historic standpoint. I really enjoy this paradoxical approach. And I think that's why so many historians that love Russian history. Russia is a huge paradox the whole time. It is like a state and identity crisis that's been happening since Peter the Great. We're going to get into more specific Russian, and I guess I should apologize that the Kievan Rus section of this is so small. There are some good journals that are in JSTOR, but I'm trying to avoid things that are paywalled. And also, I don't have access to JSTOR right at this moment, so oh well. But if you are looking in this, you want to talk about outdated, from Charles Halperin, and it's the Golden Horde. So a little history for you. So with the Kievan Rus state, what you're going to have is Kiev as the capital of that state. And that's where the metropolitan was based. And then who should come up but the Mongols? And they take over very brutally the entirety of Russia, what we consider to be Russia. They rule, though, from down at Sarai. That is 1242 to 1502 is what this book goes to as far as coverage. You are not going to find a lot of good books about the Golden Horde. There are some good journals. Unfortunately, it's kind of like the stepchild of Khanates. It's a lot more interesting for Mongolian historians to cover actual Mongolia, to cover the Chinese, and then obviously the more Muslim Khanates. Alas, Genghis Khan, we knew thee well. But this is as good as you're going to get, really, as an explanation of the Golden Horde, at least as far as I know. Oh gosh, when are you from? You were from the Wayback Machine. You were from 1985. But if you want an explanation of how Mongol rule worked in Russia, this is a good starting place. It's not too academic. It's very readable. Go for Charles. And then along that line, from a more academic standpoint, if you are looking to read primary sources, and I don't know how many laymen are really interested in reading primary sources, then the 3 recommendations I have to you is the first Chronicle of Novgorod, and that one is going to be from 1016 to 14 something. What is it? 1471. I don't own that. I think it's like a $30 book, if that's what you're into. That's something that I read in college, in my college's library. And then for other primary sources, then you would want the Travels of Marco Polo and the Travels of Ibn Battuta. Neither one of them actually really went into Russia proper, but they both were dealing with the Mongol horde, the Mongol Khans. And I think that picture that they paint is really useful in understanding what life was like under the Khanate rule. If you're looking for primary sources, those are the 3 that you would want for Russia during the Golden Horde. And there are more, but it's hard to get them in English, or at least they were 10 years ago when I was trying to find them in English. I bet it's so much easier now. I bet everything is on the internet. It's all scanned and digital, I bet. From there, we would go to, and you'll laugh at me for including this, but I really think that literature is a great entryway point. So if you're not interested in reading a historic text, and you're not interested in reading 3 primary sources from the 1300s, then may I recommend to you the series by Catherine Arden, The Bear and the Nightingale, and then the other 2 are The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch, I think, which these are pure fiction, but they take place towards the end of Mongol control in Russia. And they are very enjoyable. They are culturally, I think, very Russian. They feel very Russian, and they're a fairy tale. If you're not looking for hard history, but looking for a good time, I really think that these Catherine Arden books are very, very good. Look, it's a little blue on top of the red. Look, it's more red. The Battle of Kulakova is from 1380, and it is where the Grand Prince of Moscow, Dmitry, is able to push the Golden Horde out. It's very, very significant. And after that, we slide into Imperial Russian history. And there's like it's not even really imperial, it's independent Russian history. Imperial Russia does begin with Peter the Great. He declares himself an emperor imperial. So before then, we kind of have this feeling very medieval time period. And my list, in a way, is kind of incomplete. So you don't have to tell me. I know that I've neglected Ivan the Terrible. I know that I have neglected the Time of Troubles. I know that the transition of the Romanovs is relatively neglected here. But all that said, I think that it is pretty acceptable not to do a specific book. Those areas are covered relatively well in some of the overview books, specifically in the Romanov book that I'm going to bring up a little bit later. And if you're really interested in Ivan the Terrible, there is a book that is a biography of Ivan the Terrible. And I know Charles Halperin also has a book about Ivan the Terrible. I have not read either of these. And then I also know that there are a few specific books about the times of trouble, if you're really interested in that. And that's where you're dealing with conflict with the Ottoman Empire, with the Khanate in Crimea, when you're dealing with difficulty with Lithuania and Poland. So it is an interesting and complicated period to study, and how it ends is with the first Romanov, Mikhail, gaining the throne. All of that aside, I am also neglecting rather egregiously the Orthodox Church. As you'll see, that seems probably pretty unfair because I'm going to talk a little bit about Islam. A lot of books cover a lot about the Orthodox Church. Specifically with the Walter Moss book, there's a great deal that's said about the Orthodox Church. So this book, Loris, also says a good deal about the Orthodox Church. And I think it also puts in good perspective how weird monks in Russia were allowed to be. So when we get all the way at the end of the imperial period and you've got Rasputin with the Romanovs, you may be thinking, why did they let this guy anywhere near anybody? This guy's weird, and he is weird. But there's a long history of weird monks running around in Russia. And this book is literature. It's not a historical book, but it is very eye-opening, I think, to how weird one can be religiously in Russia. So I would not say that this is a book that is a big book. It's not necessarily one that I feel passionately in love with, but I do think it is useful for understanding a specific time and place, and doing so with the lens of literature and getting a good idea about how the peasant relationship with religion might have worked, or what was considered normal and acceptable at that time period. At that time period, which by the way is the 1400s. I didn't make that clear. So the time period for this one is 1400s. Then we're gonna just skip right ahead to the Romanovs. I don't have that one on me either. That was a library book. It is a good overview of the Romanovs. It's probably one of the most popular Russian history books right now, so I don't feel like I can leave it off the list. It is modern, it is good, it is well written. I don't have complaints about it, but it does feel sometimes a little pop history, in the same way that like Orlando Fige's books also feel a little pop. And by pop history, I just mean it's popular, more for a mass consuming audience, which the Romanovs was. But also there's something wrong with that. Like if you're wanting to read a general overview of the Romanovs and that's what you're looking for, this is a great option. If you were looking to spend a month with Peter the Great, though, boy, do I have a pick for you. Peter the Great, His Life and His World, 850 pages from Robert Massie. I think this book is also from the 80s. Maybe it's from the 90s. Yeah, this book is from 1980, so it is 45 years old almost. It is still such a great biography of Peter the Great. I have nothing but good things to say about Robert Massie's writing styles. It's very engaging. I had a great time reading this. I read it before I even knew too terribly much about Russia. So this was one of my early obsession books, and it only fueled the flames. So Peter the Great is the Tsar who takes Russia from being kind of a backwater and just propels it kicking and screaming into being a European power. So if you want to point to where the identity crisis starts for Russia, it is really with Peter the Great, who makes all the boyars shave their beards and act European. He builds St. Petersburg, and it is an architectural wonder, St. Petersburg. It's amazing. And he does that on the backs of a lot of really poor people who died building it. He starts the tradition where where they can name their own successors. So basically you can be like, you're going to be the king or the queen or the empress. So he names his wife, who's like this peasant from Hungary, Catherine I, as the empress after he dies. And she's not Russian, and she becomes empress. Peter the Great is a weird and interesting character. You'll hear me say that a lot about Romanovs. And I think that this biography is almost essential reading for really appreciating Peter the Great, you can't miss him. If you're going to miss anybody in Russian history, you have to read about Peter the Great. After you have slogged your way through this Robert Massie book, may I recommend another Robert Massie book to you, and that is Catherine the Great. This one is much more current. I think this was from 2011. Okay, so this is from 2011, so a far more current book as far as biographies go. I don't think this one has been matched either for a Catherine book. The fact that there is this German princess who comes in, she is not in a good position for a long time, and she makes herself the Empress of Russia. That is so impressive and so cool. This is a good book. And if you are into biography, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, you can't go wrong with these two. Along those same lines, if you are looking for a primary source from the time period of Catherine the Great, I would really recommend Princess Dashkova. That's something that I also don't have anymore. It's pretty dry, but it's a diary from a princess, which does not mean the same thing in Russia. Princess or prince is something more along the lines of a count or a lord or a lady. It just means somebody within the nobility, more or less. But it does not necessarily mean that you are an imperial prince or an imperial princess. But she is still a very wealthy lady, and it is a primary source that is really great at explaining what time was like during Empress Catherine's court. Next, you had to know it was coming. It's War and Peace. Tolstoy is so fundamental to the understanding of Russian literature that you really can't avoid it. War and Peace is about the Napoleonic Wars. It is a very useful and helpful text in understanding the Napoleonic Wars. If you have a decent understanding of where this is being placed in history, so that's saying from 1805 to 1820, that makes it a much more consumable book. So I would recommend get an overview like what we have over here, read about that time period, the Napoleonic Wars. You're going to be looking at Tsar Alexander I. And once you've read that, give War and Peace a fair attempt at that. And there might be parts of it that are kind of dry. Tolstoy, he sure does like to philosophize. And, you need the characters all listed out. You need to know who we're talking about. I understand all of that. War and Peace is a dirge sometimes to get through, but once you have, it is such a valuable brick. It's almost like a cornerstone that all other pieces that come after it have a certain legacy behind. Even if it's to run away from that legacy, even it's to counter-prevail that legacy, War and Peace really matters. And it matters even just in general for great literature. The thing about great literature is that it's not always fun to read, but once you've analyzed it and digested it for yourself, it is wonderful to know and to have that cultural collateral. And War and Peace for me was something that I had to make myself get through. And then once I did, I was really grateful that I had done it. That's my spiel on War and Peace. I have a whole video that's an hour. It's my first ever though, so it's probably really horrible to watch back now. If you want to hear me talk about War and Peace for an hour, that does exist. So our friend Eugene. Pushkin is a poet, and this book specifically is all in verse. So it is all translated Russian poetry from Pushkin. It tells a narrative story. I think it is beautiful. I think this is just an absolutely wonderful and beautiful example of Russian poetry. Pushkin is, I don't want to say he's underrated because he's not. Everyone knows Pushkin, right? But I just think that if you really want to appreciate Pushkin, this is the way to go. This one, it was serialized between 1825 to 1832, and then it's published in 1833. Eugene Onegin, I feel like I always say it wrong, but I think that this is beautiful literature, beautiful poetry, and it's well worth a read. And, it goes into the imperial stuff. So one of the reasons I'm suggesting literature, by the way, is because sometimes literature is just such an easier way to consume history than history books. And history books can seem really dry. They can seem really repetitive. Sometimes the authors don't clarify very well. But what a history-based literature does, so, in its contemporary time period, is it's such an excellent window into what was considered normal. So when you read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which I think is kind of the most famous Regency era novel that we have from Britain, you are given so much information about what it was like to live in the Regency era that never has to be really told to you. It's just shown to you. And sure, on YouTube Shorts, it might be really fun to see someone discuss all the intricacies of that. But it's the same way when you're reading Russian literature, where there's just so much shown about how people actually lived, the debts that they ran up, the extravagant lifestyle that the nobles have. My goodness, doesn't this explain 1917? Once you see the excess that's here and a few other ones, once you see that, it's completely apparent why the Russian Revolution happens. So this is, if you want to understand why Russia was as dysfunctional as it was, why it didn't function, why revolution came, you don't need to read the Communist Manifesto for that, though I do think that's useful, as we will get to. You need to read literature for that. Dead Souls, this is the serf problem. You want to understand serfdom and Russia and how weird it was and how crazy it was and how illegal certain parts of it were, but were not enforced. Dead Souls. Serfdom in Russia is slavery, but not really, but it is, so that's a problem. And it's that the peasants are tied to the land and they can't be sold away from the land, but yes, they actually can, and that's a problem. Can you just sell dead serfs and not report that they're dead? And that's a problem. Serfdom is a problem and it needs to be resolved, and it is the can that is proverbially kicked down the road of the Tsars for a long, long time. Like Catherine the Great knew serfdom was a problem, and she just was like, that's going to be for someone else to handle, not for me. And that is what happened. It wasn't for her. The serfs are liberated in 1861 by Tsar Alexander II, and that is some necessary thing to do. And then Gogol, this book, Dead Souls, takes place in 1842. So it's about 20 years before the liberation of the serfs. It is so important. The serfs and the issue of the peasant class is part of this pressure cooker that is leading us to 1917. Dead Souls is a great way to get a feeling of the serf part of the pressure cooker. It's more Orlando Figes, popular history for you. The Crimean War takes place from 1853 to 1856. It is an unmitigated disaster for the Russians. They attempt to do that thing that Russia is always trying to do, which is get a warm water port. And are they successful? No, they are not. And a lot of people died. So the Crimean War had a lot of war veterans come back to being injured, to being deeply unhappy, to having PTSD. And the government didn't do anything about that. They just kind of were like, yeah, I'll get on. And and the problems continue for Russia. Crimean War is going to add to that continually boiling pressure cooker of Russia is finding that it cannot compete on the European stage the way that they would like to. And how are they going to fix this problem? Well, one of the solutions that happens is the freeing of the serfs to enact more education reforms and then to focus on building up a better military. And that goes medium, Turgenev, Fathers and Sons. This one is going to take place in the 1860s. This is the serfs have been free. There feels that something has to change in the Russian consciousness and the way things are. People are wanting a populist revolution, perhaps, but this is taking place in the backdrop. You've got the liberation of the serfs and how kind of more conservative fathers with their more liberal sons are contending with each other in a modernizing Russia, and how the fathers aren't doing well, but the sons aren't necessarily doing great either. This is short and sweet. It is very approachable. I think it's only this is like 160 pages or something. This is a really easy literature block to read. And we are starting to get to the point where some of these ideas are going to be influencing Vladimir Lenin, our other revolutionary friends that we're going to be meeting. When they are being educated, this is considered cutting edge literature. Also in the 1860s, we're going to have Dostoevsky. So I have picked Crime and Punishment as one of my 50. There are other Dostoevsky books that are equally good. I really like The Idiot. They are harder for me to read personally than Tolstoy. So it's a little Count of Monte Cristo for me. There's not a lot of fun happening. Not that there's a lot of fun happening in any Russian literature. That's part of the point. But anyway, Crime and Punishment, it's great for the corruptness of Russia in the 1860s. And then obviously we're going to conclude with Anna Karenina. his first true novel, he would say, because he does not consider War and Peace to be a true novel. I like War and Peace more than Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina makes me want to punch her in the face about 1,000,000 times. She is the most frustrating of characters, but this is taking place in the 1870s, I believe. And that is a great insight into the opulence of the era, of the issues that soldiers are having, this tension that Russians are having between serfs and freedom, and between what it means to have this serf population, what are the responsibilities of landowners towards educating their serf populations, how are Russians going to connect with Europeans about innovations and technological innovations, and farming. What is the priority of the Russian people? Is it going to be in that more industrial urban environment, or is it returning to what Leo Tolstoy would argue to be a more rural Russian, true Russian experience, where Russian men and Russian women are most free when they're outside of Moscow and outside of St. Petersburg. They're able to let go of the opulence and embrace what it means to truly be themselves and become responsible landowners. Yada, yada, yada. All the parts of Anna Karenina that don't involve Anna or Count Vronsky are parts I am far happier to read. I don't care about Anna and her stupid love affair. She just makes bad decisions the whole time. But all the stuff with Lev, I really like. And I wonder if that's a typical experience or not. I don't know. But that was my experience, and I prefer War and Peace. But that's about the Napoleonic Wars, which is kind of backwards looking for Tolstoy, because he wrote it in the early 1860s. So this is putting us in more modern Russia. So it's very different from War and Peace as far as where we are in the timeline, which is why it's later, even though it's written relatively contemporaneously. It's also why I put War and Peace so much earlier than Dostoevsky, because all of these are contemporaries of each other from a literature standpoint. And also why you should read all of them is because they are looking at the same problem from different angles. And they're not coming up with really any solutions. They're just like, there is a problem here, and there is a problem here, so let's continue on, which is to not what you're thinking I'm going to talk about, I am sure. So that's us getting through Imperial. So obviously the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is the fall of Russia and the Russian Revolution. Wrong. I'm going to talk to you about Islam. Do you need to know about Islam to understand Russia? Yes, you do. And I know I said I have not recommended a specific book about the Orthodox Church. I think that there is enough Orthodox baked in to a lot of Russian sources that you will have an understanding of the Orthodox Church. If you want more, you can Google it. I don't know. I haven't found a really great book that's like, this is an introductory to the history of the Orthodox Church. If someone knows that in the comments, please recommend it, because I have not seen one. This is an excellent book about the origins of Islam, and it is much longer than anyone needs to read about Islam. If you understand the Sufis, which are, I don't even know how to necessarily describe it, they're kind of like monks of Islam at this time period. And they're the ones who are going to be the ones going up into Central Asia and converting a large number of that population to Islam. And the reason this matters is because Russia's population during the Soviet Union is hugely Islamic, or they were, because religion is outlawed, but they are Muslims. And the Iron Curtain includes Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. So you've got these majority Muslim countries, states, and along that line, I will just kind of skip ahead here and talk about some Central Asian books that I think are helpful. So for this, you have Inside Central Asia, and this is outdated already, and that's kind of the problem when you start getting too modern. This stops, I think, from where it's published, so 2010 maybe. I don't think there's been another edition of this yet. Yeah, 2011, and this is so good, but now it is 10 years out of date when you're looking at very rapidly changing states, or at least adjusting states. The regimes have changed and altered slightly. But if you're looking to understand that Central Asian area, then this is an absolutely excellent book that's going to go from the fall of the Soviet Union forward. And then this book right here, The Railway, is going to be taking place in Uzbekistan from 1900 to 1980. It is a very useful exploration into what literature from a Central Asian location has to offer. If you're wanting to understand kind of more of that Central Asia behind the Iron Curtain perspective instead of the more Western facing, you're looking at Poland and Hungary and Romania and places like that, which are also very important to look into. But my focus has always kind of been more Central Asian based anyways. I would say that these are two books that are very helpful for that. Putting a pause into Islam and why you should understand it. You need to understand Islam so you can understand Central Asia, which is part of the Soviet state. And also the identity that they had to find after the Soviet state varied because they had to refigure out how to be Muslims. Okay, next, theory. So this is What Is to Be Done by Chernyshevsky, and it is a horrible, horrible novel. This is one of the worst written novels I've ever read. It is pivotal for Lenin. This novel inspired Vladimir Lenin and a bunch of communists like nothing else. This is some bad writing. It makes no sense, this plot, but it is something that you get to read if you would like to understand a little bit of Vladimir Lenin. If you'll notice What Is to Be Done, I also recommend that you read from a theory standpoint, What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, which is his treatise on how to move forward with the revolution. Essential reading. Other theory essential points that you should read would be The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. And ooh, what a dirge that is. But also beyond just Russian history, you should read The Communist Manifesto so you have an idea of what so horrifyingly gripped the world for so long. And then after you read that, can I recommend to you, out of left field, this book? It's called Heaven on Earth, The Rise and Fall of Socialism. I disagree that socialism has fallen. This is a history of different early pockets of socialism. It is useful in kind of understanding the picture of who Karl Marx was, who Engels was, and then some other socialist experiments along the way. This idea that you can bring heaven on earth through socialism, through state enforcement, it's never ended well, has it? So I think that after you have read The Communist Manifesto and no doubt wanted to throw up because it's so horrible, read this and figure out what a horrible person Marx was outside of the Communist Manifesto, because guess what? He was horrible the whole time. If we're in the revolution, I have to first recommend to you Fitzpatrick's The Russian Revolution, which after you've read Marx is great to read this because you'll see how the Russian Revolution absolutely failed as a communist revolution. It did not follow any of the Marxist principles. And one might argue that the Russians had to push themselves to be constantly in a state of revolution, really through Stalin. And that's what Fitzpatrick argues. The revolution just didn't stop, can't stop, won't stop. And this is also a very short history book. And I think it's fantastic for understanding the February, October, and then the perpetuating revolution of the communist state, the civil war that they had to fight after, which was like 6 years. It was a long civil war. More recent is another book named The Russian Revolution, and that's by McMeekin. It is a solid addition into the conversation of Russian Revolution. It's a little bit more modern. It's got some more recent sources in it. This will do you just fine. But if you want a second one about the Russian Revolution, McMeekin's good. Robert Massie's The Romanovs. He has written another book, and chalk that up to honorable mentions if you'd like, called Nicholas and Alexandra. And that is also about the Romanovs. And this one kind of goes into all of the speculations and rumors about Anastasia and whether or not she actually was killed. She was. It goes into forensic data. I think this, because it is a little bit more recent, it has some more genetic testing and modern technologies, is a really interesting twist on the conversation of the Romanovs. I'm sure that there are more recent examples of books about Nicholas and Alexandra, but I just love Robert Massie's writing style. Obviously, the Romanovs get shot in Yekaterinburg, and the White Army cannot protect them. The Reds kill them, and they are not able to escape Russia even after Nicholas II abdicates. Lenin takes control, and we're pulling out of World War I and going through a period of economic revolutionization until we hit World War II. But before we get to World War II, we have to do Stalin. So Stalinist Russia is a wild, crazy place. It is a horrible place. It is nowhere you would want to live. Neither is Leninist Russia, but once we get to Stalinist, it's all bad news all the time. So From a literature or poetry standpoint, Anna Akhmatova, her poetry is some of the best from the Soviet era. I really recommend it. I think that if you look into her life and what it was like to live in that time, and what I like about this one is it has the Russian on the side and the English translation on the other. So if you speak any Russian, it's nice sometimes to get the cadence of the original. We have The Whisperers by Orlando Figes. It's Orlando Figes again. This is the best Figes book. This is a top tier. If you were looking for something to read about early Soviet Russia, this is the one to read. This is heartbreaking. He is drawing from so many primary sources. This is about the way people disappeared, the way people died, the horrors of the early Soviet state. And it's heartbreaking and it is painful. Through 2004 is when he is following up with these families and getting interviews about what it was like to disappear, to have people disappear, to have your neighbors disappear. This is a wild, crazy time. And along that similar line, and I think this is behind a paywall, so I am sorry to, recommend it to you, but Bill Whittle has what we saw. There's a Cold War one that's on Spotify, and it's a podcast. And that's just about the Cold War. But there's something called the third season of what we saw. I think it's called The Reign of Terror. And I do think that is behind a paywall. And it is brutal. And the way he talks about the Lubyanka and the murders that occurred there, and just further into the deaths caused by the communist state in Russia, it doesn't get talked about enough how brutal and bone-chillingly horrible the Soviet regime was. Plenty of people died during World War II. Many Russians died during World War II. I think they may have had the highest of the Allied casualty rate. Still more Russians died from the Soviet state, from starvation, from gulags, from being shot, from being transported really inhumanely just to spread out the population in an attempt to get rid of people's cultural languages and identities. The Soviet state was evil by most standards. And this expression, this book about how evil that state was and what it cost the Russian people, this is so good and so horrible. So if you're going to read an Orlando Figes book, this is the one I recommend. Next, The Gentleman in Moscow. This is literature. This is something my grandmother did not like. I gave it to her for Christmas and she said, "Does it ever get happy?" And I was like, no, it doesn't. It never gets happy in Russia. So The Gentleman in Moscow, this guy would have been shot and not imprisoned in a hotel. I know they give an explanation, but I don't buy it. The Soviets would have shot him. But other than that, it's a fun enough romp on a man being imprisoned, a former aristocrat being imprisoned in a nice hotel in the Soviet state, and how he functioned through that. And I think it's well-researched enough. It gets most of the details and the beats correct. And for that, I think that it is good. And I think that if you're new to Russian history and you don't want to necessarily start with War and Peace, if you're going for literature, The Gentleman in Moscow is a good literature place to start. Dr. Zhivago. So Dr. Zhivago takes place from 1905 to 1940. This is about the Russian Revolution. It's about the conflict between the whites and reds. It's about trying to avoid conflict, but being unable to. This is a great novel for understanding the revolution. And I think you have to put it in that context. If you're expecting glitz and glamour Russian, you're not going to get that here. This is pain Russian. It's the pain train the whole way. Also, there's a good movie. If you want something a little bit weird, The Devil Visits Moscow and creates some havoc during Stalinist period. Yeah, Bulgakov had something weird to say here. Heart of the Dog is the other Bulgakov novel. I prefer The Master and Margarita. This is one of my favorite pieces of Soviet literature. I don't even know how to describe it other than quite literally, the devil comes to Moscow, Satan himself. And it's funny, but it's not funny. We the Living by Ayn Rand. This is the first thing that she published. I know that if I say Ayn Rand, you're probably immediately going to want to discredit anything from Ayn Rand if you are on a certain side of the aisle. I would hesitate to do that, though, about We the Living, which is as close to a autobiography that she ever wrote. It is about escaping communist Russia, which Ayn Rand did. And it's got all the typical hallmarks of an Ayn Rand novel. It's got these very serious and cold and analytical women and the men who love them. But I don't want to get into a discussion of Ayn Rand herself. I want to get into the process of escaping communist Russia, which We the Living is an example of, and how absolutely miserable all of it was. The pain train continues on in We the Living, and you should read it for that. And then you will now notice that I am not including a ton on World War I or World War II specifically when it comes to 50 books that you can use to understand Russian history. That is because I think there are a lot of great books about World War I and World War II, but I don't necessarily think they add to the picture of who is Russia overly much or who are the Russians. I think an exception to that is Ivan's War, which I don't have on me right now. And that is, I think, far more compelling and useful to understanding the Russian view of the front, kind of in the same way that All Quiet on the Western Front is useful for understanding the way a soldier would have viewed World War I. Ivan's War is really great for that. There are great books for World War II. There are great documentaries for World War II. I do not want to take away from that, but just for me personally, I don't think that that is something that I would rank here. Anyways, after that, we have A Mountain of Crumbs. This is 1960s Soviet Union. I guess I should talk about these almost at the same time. So we also have Russia's Sputnik generation. So this is one class of graduates from the 1967 graduating class. This is from the 1960s in Soviet Russia, and it's basically an exploration of what it was like to live in Russia during the 1960s. A useful film for that period might be Stilyagi, which I think is on YouTube. It's just subtitled because it's Russian, but it's an exploration of what it was like to be a teenager in the Soviet Union while all the like American things were so popular, and you know how you used to buy like bootleg blue jeans and stuff. So this was when trying to get goods and trading goods that were American in nature were such a big deal. And I mean, like there's a lot more to it than just the consumer culture that is slowly creeping its way into the Soviet Union. There's just also the real horrors in the background that are still occurring. Like Stalin may be gone, but that does not mean it's still not an incredibly brutal state to live in. And both of these are really great in that exploration. And also just what was it like to be a kid in the Soviet Union, being a pioneer, which is one of their like children's groups that they had. We're not going to be on the pain train for this one. This is K Blows Top. This is pure funny. It's written by a journalist, so it's fun, well written. And it starts with Nixon's trip to Russia when he was the vice president, and then Khrushchev's journey to America. He was the premier of Russia during like the 50s and 60s. So he comes to America and just like bumbles around. He's a horrible person, but he kind of like has that Nebraska corn farmer feel. And he is a bonkers person. And this book is bonkers. And what Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, got up to in the United States is wild. So if you're going to read something for a good time, this is the good time. There are all these satellite Soviet states that were incorporated into the Soviet Union. It's not just Russia. It's important to talk a little bit about those. Let us start with Red Famine. This is going to be from like the 1929 to 1930s. This is how the Soviet Union pretty much brutalized Ukraine and took all their food and absolutely wrecked their everything. So this is going to be where like something around 3 million Ukrainians, we believe, died in this famine of trying to change farms into collective farming units. It did not go well. It was horrible. It led to at least 5 million people in general dying. So when we talk about the effects of the Soviet system, they moved a lot of Ukrainians and dispersed them throughout the Russian population and moved a bunch of Russians into Ukraine. And so when you look today and they're like, Ukraine is a certain amount of ethnic Russians, that's true. But part of that is because Russians were moved into Ukraine and Ukrainians forcibly moved out of Russia during the Soviet Union. The same can be said with pretty much every former Soviet satellite state. It was an attempt to break down culture, religion, and language and create everybody as a proletariat Russian individual that was only going to have allegiance to the state and not to God, not to their personal country. And in a way to break up family units too. If you've got like with the Whispers, with the Orlando Figes, where you're supposed to tell on your family if you see something you're not supposed to see, it breaks down the family unit. So what the Soviet Union was trying to do was break down every bond an individual might have and instead turn that allegiance towards the state. And what that resulted in was a lot of people super, super dead in horrifying ways. So Red Famine, you're going to be looking at Ukraine mostly for that one, though obviously it's a broader USSR conversation as well. In the expatriation sort of way, where you talk about people being forcibly moved, this book takes place in 1941 with Lithuania, and this is a girl who is forcibly moved away from her home in Lithuania. And it is brutal, and I cried a lot. It's horrible. This is fiction. This was a hard read for me, Between the Shades of Grey. I felt bad for it too, because 50 Shades of Grey, I think, came out right around here too. Great Game and Great Gamble. So The Great Game right here. Hi, this is Hopkirk. This is Afghanistan history. And this is mostly from the British perspective. So you may be thinking, what is this going to teach me about the Soviet Union or Russia? And at the time of Nicholas I, who's the successor to, so it goes Catherine the Great, it goes Paul, it goes Alexander, and then it goes Nicholas I. So Nicholas I is kind of this interim middle ground czar, and he is stretching his imperial wings. He is wanting to gain some territory, and he is looking at the jewel of India to a certain extent and to Afghanistan to get there. So he sends an exploration force down through Uzbekistan, through Bukhara, and down into Afghanistan, and the British are there pretty much to fight a covert and secret war. So the Great Game is whether or not Russia is going to have any true influence in Afghanistan and India. They obviously do not. And how serious Nicholas I ever was in forcing that conversation is debatable. Like, he sent some soldiers, but I don't know if it was as real a threat as the English thought it would be. But in any case, this is kind of Russia's first exploration into Afghanistan. And then we get their other exploration into Afghanistan with Gregory Feifer's The Great Gamble, which is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that took place from 1979 to 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it did not go well for the Soviets. It was a long and drawn out process. The Americans were involved too, obviously. It's going to lead to some other radicalizing issues that go on to basically create the Taliban. So if you want to kind of see how the end of the Cold War plays out and what that looks like, this is an exceptional book about that, about kind of the last great Cold War states, which is Afghanistan. And then, by 2001, Afghanistan becomes a conversation once again to today. So no one can stay out of Afghanistan. The British can't do it. The Russians can't do it. Americans can't do it. Everyone is very concerned about creating some sort of stability in Afghanistan, and yet no one will do it. Okay, post-Soviet. I don't always go very far post-Soviet, but if you are going to go, I would recommend Crisis and the Everyday Post-Socialist. It's 1990s. It's what it was like to be in kind of this booming potential that was 1990s Moscow, when suddenly all the regulations were pretty much dropped. But then it led to the creation of oligarchs who were taking extreme financial advantage of the system. You had tons of money being made by a very select few number of people who were then able to write the laws and regulations of the early, post-Soviet state. And, the oligarchs pretty neatly lead to Putin, though I will not be getting into Putin today. And then finally, we have Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets by Svetlana Alexievich. I think that is also a really excellent exploration of late Soviet Union into the 1990s. It feels like you never really get to give happy news about what time was like in Russia, do you? Especially for the last 100 years. It has been a really difficult time. Hopefully these have been useful book selections. I hope that you maybe have something to add. If you have book recommendations for me, I would be really excited to see them. There's so much to read about Russia. It's got a really long and intricate history that is a really interesting exploration into authoritarianism, to what it means to rule such a large state, of what population centers look like, and can you force a state to change very rapidly, or a people group to change by sheer will of the state. Peter the Great is as much of an example of that as Lenin and Stalin. So that is today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.